The steam rose in lazy spirals from the quenching barrel as Kaito Nakamura lifted the glowing steel from its depths. The workshop's autumn shadows danced across ancient tools that had belonged to his grandfather, and his grandfather's grandfather before him. For 15 generations, the Nakamura family had forged blades in this mountain sanctuary, but never one quite like this. The news feeds chattered in the background about humanity's first contact with the consortium of allied species. Diplomatic vessels hung in orbit like silver tears suspended in the night sky, visible even now through his workshop skylight. But Kaito's focus remained on the steel before him, his calloused hands knowing each fold, each hammer strike required to create something extraordinary. "Master Nakamura," a voice called from the workshop's entrance. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Ambassador Zwextal's crystalline form caught the forge's light, scattering rainbow refractions across the ancient wooden walls. The alien diplomat moved with careful grace, mindful of the low ceiling. Kaito bowed slightly, never taking his eyes off the cooling steel. "You honor my humble workshop, Ambassador. Though I confess, I'm surprised to find you so far from the official ceremonies in Tokyo." The crystalline being's facets shifted in what Kaito had learned was their equivalent of a smile. "Those ceremonies are precisely why I'm here. The consortium has observed humanity's remarkable attachment to symbols and traditions. We've studied your species extensively, and your family's name appeared in our research." Kaito allowed himself a small smile as he began to work the steel again, each strike of his hammer precise and purposeful. "We are but simple craftsmen, Ambassador. Surely there are more important matters requiring your attention?" On the contrary, Zwextal moved closer, crystalline appendages folding in fascination as they watched Kaito work. "Your family's blades have marked turning points in your nation's history. The sword that sealed the Meiji Restoration. The tanto that brokered peace in the Pacific. Symbols, Master Nakamura, have power." The hammer's rhythm never faltered as Kaito considered the ambassador's words. "And what symbol does the consortium seek now?" "A bridge," Zwextal replied. "Something to span the vast distance between our peoples. The consortium fears, well, humanity's reputation precedes you. Your adaptability, your resilience, your capacity for both creation and destruction. Some members of the consortium view Earth's admission with concern." Kaito paused, studying the glowing steel before him. "And you believe a blade can ease these concerns?" "Not just any blade, Master Nakamura. A blade forged by your hands, combining Earth's traditions with elements from across the galaxy." Zwextal produced a small container that seemed to swirl with starlight. "Metal from the heart of a dying star, collected by the consortium's stellar harvesters. Combined with your Earth steel, worked by methods passed down through your family line." Kaito set down his hammer, finally giving the ambassador his full attention. "Such a blade would be unprecedented. The techniques required to merge these materials would need to be developed through trial and error. It could take months, even years to perfect. Time," Zwextal's crystalline form pulsed softly, "is something the consortium is willing to invest in this endeavor. We believe this fusion of traditions could become more than a mere diplomatic gesture. It could become a symbol of what our peoples might achieve together." As night fell over the mountain workshop, Kaito began sketching designs in his leather-bound notebook, while Zwextal shared stories of the celestial forges where their stellar metal was harvested. Neither could have known then that the blade taking shape in those rough sketches would one day save both their civilizations, or that it would become known throughout the galaxy as the star-forged mediator. But that story was yet to come. For now, there was only the quiet scratch of pencil on paper, the cooling ping of worked metal, and two beings from vastly different worlds finding common ground in the ancient art of crafting something beautiful and lasting from raw elements. Outside, the diplomatic vessels continued their silent vigil over Earth, their lights mingling with the stars, while in a mountain workshop in Japan, the first steps toward a shared future were being carefully, methodically forged. 10 years had passed since the first meeting between Kaito Nakamura and Ambassador Sci-Fi. The blade that had begun as a diplomatic gesture had evolved into something far more significant. Rei Nakamura stood before the Consortium Council, her father's masterwork secured at her hip, its scabbard gleaming with inlaid stellar metal that seemed to capture and release light with each movement. The council chamber aboard the massive station, Unity, was designed to accommodate representatives from over 300 species. Crystalline beings like Zwaxtal shared space with methane-breathing giants and silicon-based intelligences. But today, all attention focused on the human woman who dared to wear a weapon in their presence. Specialist Nakamura, the council speaker's translation matrix converted their harmonic tones into crisp Japanese. Explain why you believe this, implement of violence should be permitted within these chambers. Rei's hand rested lightly on the blade's hilt, a gesture that caused several council members to shift uncomfortably. Honorable Speaker, this blade represents the very foundation of human consortium relations. My father spent 7 years perfecting the technique to merge terrestrial steel with stellar metal. Every fold, every layer tells our shared story. The speaker's upper appendages waved dismissively. Pretty words, but they do not address the fundamental concern. Humanity's admission to the consortium remains controversial. Your species' capacity for violence is matched only by our capacity for creation, Rei interrupted, a breach of protocol that sent murmurs through the chamber. With deliberate movements, she drew the blade, its surface rippling with patterns that mimicked the flow of stellar matter. Several security drones moved forward, but Ambassador Zwaxtal, now a senior council member, raised an appendage to halt them. This blade, Rei continued, holding it flat across her palms, was forged not as a weapon, but as a bridge. The stellar metal we received from you taught us new ways to work with heat and pressure. The techniques my father developed have already been adapted for manufacturing processes in 3 consortium worlds. She stepped forward, offering the blade for inspection. Look closely at the pattern along the spine. My father encoded the mathematical sequence that defines the golden ratio, a principle we discovered independently but shares remarkable similarities with consortium aesthetic guidelines. This blade is physical proof that our peoples can create together, learn from each other. A methane giant counselor leaned forward, specialized sensors examining the blade. The patterns, they mirror the flow dynamics in our gas mining operations. How is this possible? Because, Honorable Counselor, Rei smiled, the fundamental laws of nature don't recognize species boundaries. The way metal flows under heat, the way stars forge elements, the way your people harvest gases, they're all connected. My father saw these connections and wove them into this blade. The chamber fell silent as the blade was passed carefully from member to member, each finding something familiar yet foreign in its craftsmanship. When it finally returned to Rei, the speaker's tone had softened. Your father's work is impressive. But it does not address the broader concerns about humanity's role in the consortium. With respect, Speaker, I believe it does. Rei sheathed the blade with practiced grace. This blade shows that humans don't just adapt, we synthesize. We take the best of what we encounter and forge it into something new. Yes, we can be violent. Yes, we can be destructive. But we can also be the bridge between disparate peoples, the force that binds rather than breaks. Ambassador Zwaxtal's crystalline form caught the light as they moved forward. I was there when this blade was conceived. I watched Master Nakamura fail countless times before succeeding. Each failure taught him, and us, something new. Is this not the very essence of what the consortium strives to be? The debate continued for hours, but something had shifted in the chamber. The blade had become more than a symbol, it was tangible proof that humanity's legendary adaptability could serve a greater purpose than conquest or destruction. As Rei finally left the chamber, messages were already flowing through the consortium's networks. The techniques developed for the blade would revolutionize manufacturing processes across dozens of worlds. More importantly, the story of its creation would become required study in diplomatic training, a reminder that the most powerful bridges between peoples are often forged in the most unexpected ways. That night, in her quarters aboard Unity, Ray composed a message to her father back on Earth. "The blade performed perfectly today, Father. Though perhaps not in quite the way either of us expected." She smiled, watching the stars through her viewport, knowing that somewhere out there, new alloys were being forged using principles first discovered in a mountain workshop in Japan. The consortium emergency session erupted in chaos as news of the Proxima Centauri incident reached Unity Station. Holographic displays showed the aftermath: 3 consortium vessels destroyed, a human colony ship damaged, and accusations flying from both sides. After decades of careful diplomacy, the alliance teetered on the brink of collapse. Rei Nakamura stood at the chamber's center, her father's blade a steady weight at her hip. She had aged since her first appearance before the council, silver threading through her dark hair, lines of experience marking her face. But her stance remained unwavering as species after species demanded humanity's immediate expulsion from the consortium. The humans deliberately violated the neutral zone, thundered the Hellion representative, their plasma-based form roiling with anger. They knew our sacred sites were there. "Our colony ship was under attack by pirates," Ray countered, her voice cutting through the din. "They sought sanctuary in what they believed was unclaimed space. The star maps we were provided showed no restricted zones in that sector." "Convenient excuses," hissed a silicon-based elder. "Just as your kind always provides." Perhaps the isolationists were right about humanity all along. The mention of the isolationist faction, a growing movement advocating for the removal of a volatile species from the consortium, sent fresh waves of discord through the chamber. Ambassador Ziwextal, now bearing the scars of crystalline age, moved to speak but was shouted down by younger representatives. Ray closed her eyes, remembering her father's words from long ago. Sometimes, he had told her, the strongest statement is made in silence. With deliberate movements, she drew the star-forged blade. The chamber's security systems immediately activated, energy barriers humming to life. But Ray ignored them, instead kneeling and laying the blade on the ground before her. The action was so unexpected that the chaos gradually subsided, replaced by confused silence. "This blade," she spoke into the quiet, "carries within it materials from 12 different consortium worlds. The stellar metal from the crystalline peoples. Pressure-forged carbon from the silicon elders. Trace elements from the Hellion sacred stars themselves. My father spent 7 years learning how to bond these materials, understanding their properties, respecting their nature." She stood, leaving the blade on the ground. When he finally succeeded, he discovered something remarkable. These materials, which by all known science should have been incompatible, strengthened each other. The blade is stronger than any of its individual components, not despite their differences, but because of them. "Pretty metaphors will not undo the deaths at Proxima Centauri," the Hellion representative growled, but their plasma form had stabilized somewhat. "No, they won't," Ray agreed. "Nothing can undo death. But we can prevent more from occurring." She turned slowly, meeting the gaze of each council member. "I propose an exchange. An ancient human tradition, adapted for our times. Among my ancestors, warriors who wished to end conflicts would exchange blades, each taking responsibility for the other's honor." She gestured to the weapon before her. "This blade already belongs to all of us. It was forged from your materials, by human hands, for the purpose of building bridges. Let it serve that purpose again. I propose that it be dismantled." A shock ran through the chamber. Even Ziwextal's crystalline form flickered in surprise. "Not destroyed," Ray continued, "but separated into its component materials. Each piece to be held in trust by a different member world. No one gets to claim it entirely, but everyone holds a piece. When we face conflicts like this in the future, and we will, the blade can be reassembled, but only if all parties agree to meet and negotiate. The silicon elder leaned forward. You would sacrifice your father's masterwork? My father forged this blade to serve a purpose, Ray replied. What better purpose than to become a physical reminder of our interdependence? Besides, she smiled slightly, he's already begun work on another. One that incorporates materials from 20 worlds, not just 12. The debate that followed lasted for days. The blade was analyzed, its composition studied in detail. Experts from a dozen worlds confirmed that its properties defied conventional metallurgical science. In the end, the council approved Ray's proposal with a significant majority. The ceremony of dismantling drew observers from across the consortium. Each component was carefully separated and entrusted to a different world, with detailed records of how they fit together. The incident at Proxima Centauri was investigated thoroughly, revealing miscommunications and errors on both sides that could be addressed. As Ray watched the final piece, the handle wrapped in silk from Earth, being formally presented to its custodian, she received a message from her father. The blade has fulfilled its purpose, Kaito wrote. Now, shall we discuss the next one? The forge is hot, and the stars have many more secrets to share. In the years that followed, the reassembly ceremony would become a cornerstone of consortium diplomacy. The mere suggestion that a situation might require reassembling the star-forged mediator was often enough to bring conflicting parties to the negotiating table. The blade that had been created to build bridges had become something more, a reminder that the strongest alliances are forged from distinct parts, each maintaining its nature while contributing to something greater than itself. 50 years after the Proxima Centauri incident, the mountain workshop of the Nakamura family had changed. Holographic forges now stood beside traditional hearths, and apprentices from 24 species worked alongside humans, each bringing their own traditions to the art of metallurgy. But in the oldest part of the workshop, Hideo Nakamura worked much as his grandfather Kaito had, with hammer, anvil, and patience. The news feeds buzzed with reports of the upcoming centennial reassembly. For the first time in 20 years, all pieces of the original star-forged mediator would be brought together. Not for a crisis this time, but for celebration. Hideo paused in his work, watching his daughter Yumi practice diplomatic forms with a training blade in the courtyard. Your grandfather would be proud, a familiar harmonic tone resonated through the workshop. Ambassador Zwextal's crystalline form had grown more elaborate with age, each facet holding decades of diplomatic service. Though perhaps surprised to see how far his legacy has spread. Hideo smiled, setting down his hammer. He always said the blade would find its own path. Though I doubt even he foresaw consortium apprentices learning earth metallurgy while humans study stellar forging techniques. The exchange program was Ray's idea. Zwextal moved carefully through the workshop, their form casting prismatic patterns across the walls. Her last initiative before retiring. She believed that if one blade could bridge worlds, many blades forged by many hands could build highways between stars. Outside, Yumi completed her forms under the watchful eye of her instructor, a silicon-based being who had studied under Kaito himself in the early days of the exchange. Her movements flowed like liquid metal, combining traditional Japanese sword arts with adaptations for low-gravity combat and zero-G maneuvering. She's ready, Hideo said quietly. For the reassembly. Zwextal's form pulsed with interest. You intend to nominate her? She's very young. Younger than Ray was when she first stood before the council, Hideo acknowledged. But she understands what the blade represents. Not just the physical object, but the principle behind it. The idea that strength comes from joining different elements rather than purifying them. The ambassador studied the young human as she bowed to her instructor. There will be opposition. Some believe the reassembly should be performed by the original custodians, or their direct successors. A human hasn't led the ceremony since Ray herself. Good, Hideo turned back to his forge. Then it's time to remind everyone that the blade's story didn't end when it was divided. It began. The weeks leading up to the centennial reassembly transformed Unity Station. Representatives from every member species arrived, bringing with them their pieces of the original blade. Each fragment had developed its own traditions and ceremonies over the decades. The Hellion plasmaforms had composed songs about the stellar metal they protected. Silicon elders had grown crystalline gardens around their fragment, teaching young ones about the strength found in apparent contradictions. When Yumi stood before the assembled consortium, she wore traditional Japanese formal wear adapted with modern environmental seals. The pieces of the star-forged mediator lay before her on a table forged from materials contributed by every member world. 50 years ago, she began, her voice clear and steady, my Aunt Ray proposed dividing this blade as a symbol of our interdependence. Today, we reassemble it not because we must, but because we choose to. Because sometimes we need to remind ourselves what we can achieve together. With movements practiced over thousands of hours, Yumi began the reassembly. Each piece had to be honored according to the traditions that had grown around it. She sang the Hellion metal songs, performed the silicon meditation rituals, and acknowledged each culture that had become part of the blade's story. As the final piece clicked into place, a murmur ran through the assembled dignitaries. The blade seemed to shimmer, the various materials remembering their connection to each other. But Yumi wasn't finished. From a case at her feet, she produced something new, a scabbard forged in the Nakamura workshop. This sheath contains elements from every world that has joined the consortium since the blade was divided, she explained. Including materials from species that were once our adversaries. Because the story of unity never ends. It must be forged anew by each generation. The blade fit the scabbard perfectly, the old and new materials resonating in harmony. As Yumi raised it for all to see, Hideo thought he glimpsed a familiar figure in the crowd, his grandfather Kaito's spirit, nodding in approval before fading away. That evening, in the quiet of her quarters, Yumi received a message from her father. Attached was a hologram of a new design, another blade, more ambitious than any that had come before. The forge is hot, Hideo had written, echoing words passed down through their family. And the stars have many more secrets to share. 100 years after Kaito Nakamura first met Ambassador Ziwextal in a mountain workshop, the Galactic Peace Museum opened its doors on Unity Station. At its heart stood a circular chamber that many would come to call the Forge of Peace, though its official name was simply the Legacy Room. The star-forged mediator hung suspended in a field of precisely calibrated energy, each of its components highlighted by soft light that changed throughout the day to honor the different worlds that had contributed to its creation. But it wasn't alone. Surrounding it were hundreds of other blades, each telling its own story of unity and cooperation. Tomiko Nakamura, great-great-granddaughter of Kaito, stood before a group of students from across the galaxy. At 90, her hair had long since turned white, but her eyes held the same fire that had driven her ancestors. Before you ask, she smiled, addressing the unspoken question in many of their expressions, yes, the original blade still functions perfectly. Every 20 years, during the reassembly ceremony, it is tested according to ancient Earth traditions. The stellar metal still flows like living starlight, the terrestrial steel still holds its edge, and the unity of its components remains as strong as ever. A young crystalline being, their form still showing the transparency of youth, raised an appendage. Elder Nakamura, is it true that your family still forges blades in the traditional way? Even with modern molecular assemblers available? We do, Tomiko nodded, moving to a display showing the evolution of forged techniques over the century. Though our definition of traditional has expanded somewhat. Every apprentice learns both the ancient Earth methods and the techniques of stellar forging. We believe that understanding the past helps us innovate for the future. She gestured to a wall where holographic displays showed various forges across the galaxy, some in the mountains of Earth, others in the crystal caves of Ziwextal's homeworld, still others in the plasma storms of Hellion space. The art of forging has become a bridge between cultures, just as that first blade was meant to be. Every year, we exchange apprentices with other worlds, learning from each other, creating new alloys and techniques that would have seemed impossible a century ago. A silicon-based elder hummed thoughtfully. Yet the original blade remains unique. None have quite matched its properties, despite a century of attempts. Tomiko's smile widened. That's not entirely accurate, honored elder. The truth is, we discovered how to replicate its exact properties decades ago. But some things are more valuable as symbols than as templates. The star-forged mediator remains unique not because we can't reproduce it, but because we choose not to. She led the group to a final display, showing the blade's complete history, from its conception in Kaito's workshop to its role in preventing wars, bridging cultures, and inspiring generations. My great-great-grandfather understood something fundamental about both metallurgy and peace. The strongest bonds are those that develop naturally, through patience and understanding. You can force metals together, just as you can force peoples to cooperate, but the results will always be inferior to those achieved through careful, intentional unity. As if to emphasize her point, the lighting in the chamber shifted, catching the blade at just the right angle to send patterns dancing across the walls, patterns that combined the mathematical principles of every member species in the consortium. The students gasped, their various sensory organs taking in the display in different ways but all recognizing its beauty. Today, Tomiko continued, there are over 1,000 diplomatic blades in service across the galaxy. Each one is unique, each tells its own story of cooperation and understanding. But they all trace their lineage back to this one, to a human blacksmith and an alien diplomat who dared to imagine what might be possible if they combined their knowledge and traditions. She touched a control panel, bringing up a final hologram, an image of the original workshop in the mountains of Japan, now preserved as a living museum where beings from across the galaxy came to study both metallurgy and diplomacy. The blade's greatest legacy isn't in what it is, but in what it inspired us to become. Every diplomatic corps in the consortium now includes metallurgists. Every forge world has its diplomats. Because we learned that the principles that govern the joining of metals are not so different from those that govern the joining of peoples. The tour concluded, but many students lingered, studying the blade from different angles, taking notes, engaging in quiet discussions. Tomiko watched them with satisfaction, noting how naturally they formed mixed groups, sharing perspectives and insights across species boundaries. Later that evening, after the museum had closed, Tomiko stood alone before the blade. Well, great-great-grandfather, she whispered, I'd say your experiment in metallurgical diplomacy was a success. She could have sworn the blade's surface rippled slightly in response, the stellar metal still active after all these years, still bridging worlds, still forging connections between the stars.